Sandler's statement on the matter was, quote, "When these fine people came to me with an offer to make 4 movies for them, I immediately said yes for one reason and one reason only. Netflix rhymes with wet chicks."
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes, and we're all kind of cooped up in the houses nowadays, and we're kind of waiting out all of the things that are happening in the world. And I think a lot of us are kind of turning to streaming services and finally maybe catching up on some of these superhero streaming shows that there's so many of them nowadays. I'm doing it myself, and what I'm finding, and I know some other people are finding, is, man, the format of a lot of these streaming shows is mimicking something that we're seeing in comic book writing, and it is severely, and I mean severely, decompressed storytelling. Like you in one comic story, you might get 2 comics issues worth of story, and it'll be spread out over 11 issues now. And I'm seeing the same thing in streaming shows. And with me today to talk about that is independent comic book writer Larry Bernard. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing pretty good because I'm trapped in the house and I can't go out to watch movies for my other show. I'm doing a lot of stuff on streaming, and so I decided to dive into a lot of streaming series that are like immersing myself in that universe, and it's slowly seeping into my brain.
Yeah, so I finally decided to dip my toe into the Titans series, that was from DC Universe. I'm overseas, so it's actually on Netflix here, and boy, that was a rude awakening. I get in there and like the casting is bad. I watched the first episode. There's not even a story in there. It just sets up some points for another story, but there's not a contained story within the episode. It's just an open-ended nothing burger that was one of the most frustrating viewing experiences I've ever had. It's one of the worst shows I've ever watched in my life.
It is terrible. I watched it because I was trying out DC Universe Online, and I was very disappointed in it.
So one of the things I noticed, like with DC movies, once, Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy came out, it was much more grounded, supposedly in reality. It was a darker, grittier version of Batman. And all of a sudden, all the DC movies that came out after that, that Zack Snyder directed and created, they're all really dark and gritty, and they're really grounded in that atmosphere. And it didn't work for Superman. It didn't really even work for his Batman after that. And it certainly, didn't work for the Justice League. And it kind of broke the universe, and it never really caught on. And I think Netflix's, Marvel's Netflix Daredevil had the same impact on a lot of these superhero streaming shows. That Daredevil series, and it makes sense that would be a dark and gritty series because it's based on a lot of the stuff that Frank Miller did. And Frank Miller is literally the king of deconstructed superhero storytelling. I think he's even better than Alan Moore, in my opinion. So it makes sense that it would work really well for Daredevil. But now it seems like this idea of deconstructed superheroes, super grounded in reality and super gritty and filled with trauma, is the basis for every superheroes like streaming show that I've seen.
Yeah, because let's talk about some of the realities of what it takes to make a streaming show. So a streaming show is 8 to 12 hours of content. If you were to do a supercut of Daredevil, of any of these shows, you could take that 8 to 12 hours and make it into a 2 to 3 hour movie, and you wouldn't lose a darn thing. You might have to do a couple little scenes to paste a few things together, but you could make all of these into a movie. So they're spending a movie's worth of money and producing 8 to 12 hours of content. So that's why these gritty shows don't work for most of them, but they worked in Daredevil because each episode of Daredevil was actually a whole television episode based around a procedural kind of television episode framework.
Yeah, that's one of the weird things. I remember, when you grow up and even some current TV shows, I like The Blacklist. There is a big overarching story arc that lasts 4 seasons in that thing. But every episode is a story. It's a self-contained story, and it takes you through this huge sweeping story that is all about the main character's history and her family and her connection with the guy with the blacklist. I can't remember his name right now. But you don't get that in these streaming shows. They're literally just, like you said, it's a 10 to 12 hour movie that never like that just needs to be compressed into 2 hours because it's tedious and boring after a while. I can't watch the same format over and over.
Yeah, and Jessica Jones works a little less well than Daredevil because, again, it focuses on the strengths of the procedural format, the detective story, the lawyer story. The other core thing that these shows do well, all the streaming shows, is they have a compelling cast. The Marvel shows that worked well, Jessica Jones, Daredevil, Luke Cage, had strong casts.
Punisher.
Most of the rest of these shows do not have a strong cast. The thing is that, again, you think there's a lot of money going into these, but there's really not. So, using Daredevil as an example, they had Vincent D'Onofrio, very famous, very heavy actor. He doesn't come in cheap. Most of the other actors were lower cost.
Mm-hmm.
You go into Jessica Jones, David Tennant is the big buy actor. Now, if you look at some of these other shows, they do pay for more expensive actors, but those tend to be the shows that aren't as good and tend to be cheaper in how they film everything else. Also, the setting, the actual physical setting of where the shows are in. It's in an apartment. It's in a hallway. It's in a restaurant. There's not a lot of these shows that do very fanciful settings. The only one that's a real notable exception in that I've dug through with this sort of archaeological study is Doom Patrol. That's the only one that's even tried to do anything fantastical with the show.
Doom Patrol actually has a good reputation. I haven't seen that one yet. I might dip my toe in that one, even though Titans kind of burnt me pretty bad. But a lot of people like Doom Patrol. And of course, they have some big name actors in that one as well. The biggest one being Brendan Fraser.
It's a return to form for Brendan Fraser. It's a great career return for him on that. Your other central thing that's good about these shows that are good is the world building, but not all of them do world building, which completely boggles my mind. So, like, the stories are very basic, very drawn out, very long, but when you go into Daredevil, you feel Marvel Comics New York. You feel it coming from every part of the show. You go into Doom Patrol, you feel the small DC town that they're in, and then you feel a couple of the weird places they go. Most of the rest of these, like, I watched a couple of episodes of Runaways that was terrible. It was a hyper generic Los Angeles.
Yeah, I've heard so many terrible things about Runaways, and it doesn't surprise me because the comic book that's been going on in Marvel for years now is also pretty bad. But I've heard the acting in that one's actually the worst.
It's very bad acting, and it's a lot of the quote unquote SJW-isms being said by teenagers, and the way they're performing it, you feel like the teenagers are saying it to be ironic, not actually because it's in their character. Another thing that made that show very unwatchable for me.
But there are, some shows, like, even outside of the superhero genre that, I don't think that The Mandalorian's a great show like a lot of other people do, but it's a pretty good show. And that one's kind of epic in scale when you think about the amount of planets they go to and what they're actually telling within that 8 to 10 hours. But even that one, I think you could make a Mandalorian movie for like 2 hours.
Well, again, that's my universal thing now about streaming service shows. You can cut them all down to a movie. And there's a movie's worth of content into them. Now, with the Mandalorian, though, we're going to compare that positively to Daredevil, because each episode is really a self-contained story. And groups of episodes have a story, and then the whole series has a story.
Yeah, it almost had a video game story vibe to it, because every time he passed like a level and beat a boss, he got a new piece of armor, like in the beginning of it.
Exactly. It was very much video game mentality, and it's very much like the good Star Wars video games. So that was something appealing towards it. But in The Mandalorian, you'll notice there wasn't really big name actors in there for a whole lot of the thing. They had like Werner Herzog, but he was like basically a glorified cameo in there. They had Carl Weathers, but again, he was basically a glorified cameo.
I think a lot of people know who Pedro Pascal is, but of course he was in the Mandalorian costume and you never saw his face.
So they weren't really paying a lot for actors there, and that's the thing you'll also notice. The good comic book streaming shows aren't paying a lot for actors.
I think a lot of comic book writers these days are looking to move into movies and streaming. And I think the way that streaming services and streaming shows are being written is terribly impacting comic books. Because when you think about Daredevil, when that came out, you could watch that entire 8 to 10 hour story in one day if you wanted to, because it was released for binge watching. But these comic book stories, they aren't released like that. They're released over amount of like 6 to 12 months, depending on the story length. Even if it's really made to be consumed kind of like a streaming show where it's a very decompressed, long form story, you can't consume it like that. It could take you half a year up to a year just to finish that one story arc. And I think it really, really falls flat in comic books.
That is one of the many problems that comic books are taking from streaming shows. And that's a thing that the comic books aren't doing, because the comic book writers are all saying, man, I want to have my Vagrant Queens moment where my comic book gets put onto a streaming service. So I'm going to write exactly like these shows want to be written. I'm going to design my world exactly like these shows want to have it designed. They'll be super generic and super cheap and super easy for the corporation to film in.
You see that a lot with Image Comics, especially. Remember, there was a comic called, I believe it was, like the concept was from Robert Kirkman, but it was written, I believe, by Andy Diggle. It was called Hardcore. And it's actually kind of a cool story, but there's no ending. It's just 5 issues of one story, but there's no episodes to it. It should just be released as a trade paperback, to be completely honest.
Absolutely. And then it should be made into a movie.
And Mark Miller, who's got his deal with Netflix, like even if you read his what was the one that was based on kind of like Kim and Kim? When you look at like Mark Miller's Space Bandits, which is going to be a Netflix show, but it was released in comic books. At least if you look at his story, like I believe it's 5 or 6 issues, but every issue is a story. They accomplish a task. They're presented with an obstacle, they overcome it, they accomplish a task on the way to a greater, end goal where they finally defeat all the people that screwed them over in the very first issue. But a lot of them aren't taking the time to write them like that. So, or at least the comic books that I'm talking about, and like you can see, there are people rising to the top with this format, and there are people absolutely floundering with it.
Yeah. And really, the gold standard, you should be trying to write something like Avatar: The Last Airbender. Did you watch that show?
All right, I'm going to be honest. I was told to watch that show, but then I tried to watch the movie first. And it ruined it for me.
Oh no! You can still watch the show. The movie literally has almost nothing to do with the show, even though it's set in the same universe. What Avatar: The Last Airbender did was there was the epic quest, and then there was intermediate epic quests that happened, and then every episode was a complete story. But there were a complete story that fit within that season's arc, and that season's arc and that complete story fit within the whole show arc. That's the standard you should set if you're going to do a streaming comic show. Because those shows are all going to run like 5 to 6 years, so you need to set it up that way. Each episode's a complete story. Like every 2 to 3 episodes is like an arc story. Every season is a season. And it should all fit in there nicely.
Yeah, it sucks because, I've almost gotten to, well, I haven't almost gotten to the point. I have gotten to the point where if I'm going through Netflix and it's got the little N logo on the title, I won't even consider watching it anymore because their movies just, they went for quantity over quality. And the movie titles just, for the most part, aren't very good. And then their streaming shows are almost all the same format, just really big, long, epic movies that are way too long and not that interesting.
And they all tend to have trauma as a central story theme, or father figure issues as a central story theme. They're very basic, very generic stories that have a lot of flashy aesthetics to try to convince you that it's something else.
Yeah, well, I've seen enough to know that it just doesn't work for me. Do you see this changing in the near future, or do you think this is the format that we're going to get into the future because it's cheap and it's a format that they know and they can put out relatively quick?
The whole world's on lockdown for a little while, then we're going to get out, and then it's going to take a couple months for production schedules to get back to normal. I have a feeling audiences may be getting burned out on some of the repetitive formatting issues from streaming things because we'll have all actually had time to watch them. So that there may be a pushback against that for the streaming shows.
Well, I hope so, because I like my Netflix because I can watch Star Trek: The Next Generation, some good shows like that. But I would appreciate some of the Netflix originals being the quality of a Daredevil, and I even liked Daredevil season 2. I didn't like the Punisher as much, but things of that quality need to be available, because otherwise I just can't take it. I cannot lower myself anymore.
And really, Daredevil is the gold standard all these shows should set themselves to, because the cast was excellent. It's the best cast cumulatively of any of these shows. Stories were well written, well crafted, immersive world building. It checks all the right boxes.
You know what's crazy about Daredevil is one of the main architects and writers was Christos Gage, and he's the backup writer like on Iron Man for Dan Slott. He writes his dialogue while Dan Slott does the scripts. Why he's not the actual writer on anything, considering he wrote one of the most compelling seasons in streaming television history, is beyond me. But I guess that's another conversation.
And also, let's face it, Dan Slott should not write things. He's not good. He should stop. There was a time when Dan Slott was a good writer, but that's like what, 5-10 years ago, maybe.
Well, he was. I don't think his Spider-Man was ever really good, and he started that about 8 years ago. So.
Yeah.
I think it's maybe been 10 years. That's rough. Give Christos Gage a better writing assignment. The man wrote Daredevil for Netflix. Well, I believe it was him and his wife.
Yeah, he should be given something better, definitely.
All right, Larry. I guess we're basically up against the clock here. We've gone about 20 minutes now. Do you have anything else that you needed to get in here before we wrap this up?
No, that'll do it. And I have an idea for the next one of these videos we're going to do. Instead of revealing Superman's secret identity or taking away Thor's hammer, do this instead. Because I keep seeing these little stories coming up over and over again in clickbait, and it's driving me insane.
There's a lot of clickbait going out there. There's not enough stuff for people to read right now, so they're just putting anything out there to entice clicks.
Yeah, so like they're going to take Thor's hammer away from him again, and I'm like saying, no, don't do that, because that literally makes less Thor stories. You think it makes more, but it really makes less.
All right, Larry, we'll have to get to that one hopefully within the next week or two, buddy.
Yeah, we got some time.
We do have time. All right, later.
Later.
If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. I would appreciate it very much. It helps us attract more views for the channel. Subscribe for future commentary, comic book news, and reviews. And don't forget to ring the bell for notifications. If you want to talk comics, movies, and much, much more, you can follow me on Twitter at Wes_from_TC. With that, Salamat Po, and I'm out.